Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Leventhal. I am the director of the USC Institute for Addiction Science. And this is our Distinguished Speaker Seminar Series. We're really excited to have Dr. Terry McGlynn here talking about a very important topic, particularly for us in addiction science. We really need to match in terms of our workforce of science, the actual diversity of the communities suffering from addiction, who we study, work with, and treat. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ricky Bluethenthal, who's a member of our institute, and he's also the Associate Dean of Social Justice at the Keck School of Medicine. And Ricky really turned me on to Dr. McGlynn's work. So let me let you take it away, Ricky. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Leventhal. I'm really excited to have Dr. McGlynn here. As some of you may know, I was a faculty member and dean at Cal State Dominguez Hills over 10 years ago and had the pleasure of becoming acquainted with Dr. McGlynn's work. Since then, I've become a huge fanboy of his Small Pond Science blog and Twitter, and I feel like he's one of the most careful and insightful thinkers about the ways in which institutional prestige is used to support institutionalized racism in higher education. Let me just give you a few particulars. He's an ecologist, an entomologist, I think I said that right, and policy communicator. He's also now the director of undergraduate research and professor of biology at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and a research associate at the National History Museum of Los Angeles County. Dr. McGlynn has led several NSF-funded projects that supported international research opportunities and mentorships for undergraduates. And as I already pointed out, he's the creator of the popular blog, Small Pond Science, which I recommend that you follow closely, and is a regular contributor to the Chronicle of Higher Education. Dr. McGlynn, thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
Oh, and hey, Terry, before you get started, I just want to say for folks in the audience who want to ask questions, you're more than welcome to text them in the Q&A box or the chat box, but we will be holding all questions till the end. So he won't answer your question until after he finishes, but Terry, take it away.
Thanks for humbling me and the really wonderful introduction. And I'm seeing who's attending here, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Okay, so first of all, the thing you might be wondering, well, why is this white guy here talking about diversity stuff? That's an important question. So first of all, I want to point out that you should be listening to many voices other than my own. I'm here to communicate from my perspective as a faculty member at CSU Dominguez Hills, where I've been working with students from minoritized groups. And seeing their careers progress. I've been there for about 13 years now. And so why am I doing this? It's like in terms of my own identity. And ultimately, because of my identity and my professional position, I'm part of this power structure. And I think people need to step up or step aside because we have to dismantle the walls, the bottlenecks, and the pipelines that are actually preventing people from accessing institutions to do research. And I think it's my role to basically, talk to fellow white folks and help become an accomplice in dismantling these structures in the way. So first, I want to just start out with a few voices that are not mine that I think are important and useful. I haven't been keen on the word inclusion since I read this from Karina Newsom last year. She says she doesn't like the word inclusion because it talks about including people in, and the context of this as if you're including people into white spaces. And so we don't need to include people. We actually need to make a genuinely equitable space by deconstructing the system that actually puts the white folks in the center. So inclusivity makes it sound like you're allowing someone in. And so that's not what we need to do. We need to actually rebuild structures that don't have that function. When I was on a search committee recently, at CSU Dominguez Hills. There was a faculty member in my department who made an observation when she was reading all of these job applications from postdocs. We were looking at the postdoctoral diversity statements, many of them which were very good, but a lot of them didn't really fundamentally get the issues of our students and our campus. And she said, she's basically, her understanding of inclusion is far more intersectional. No one really is talking about class. As far as their students are concerned, it's more about being low income as about being Latina. And so these barriers are just about class as they are race. And no one's teaching postdocs about this. And so people can go through grad school, people can go become a postdoc. And if they haven't spent time in institutions that are low prestige and spent time in institutions with predominantly low income students, then they might not necessarily get the intersectionality of these race and class issues and how that intersects with institutional prestige, which I think is really critical. Another thing I'd like to point out, and like, oh my gosh, Rhonda Montgomery is here watching this talk. So Rhonda last week gave this great keynote talk for the Black in Microbiology Week. And she had this gorgeous metaphor that is targeted towards microbiologists, but I think it works generally. And so microbes, you know, tiny little organisms that people grow on media plates. Microbiologists study these microorganisms, but it turns out only a relatively small fraction of these microbes will grow if you just put out a plate of agar to grow out these microbes. And so microbiologists spend a lot of time thinking and studying and worrying about all these microbes that you can't culture in the laboratory, but now we know they exist because you can do these genomic analyses and find out that they're there. And so microbiologists spend a lot more time worrying about that, but they actually don't necessarily realize that our academic culture functions as that kind of universal medium, thought to be universal medium, but only certain kinds of microbes can grow on that. And so our environment supports scientists who come from a very particular social, cultural, racial background, and others basically do not thrive in that environment. So if you're thinking about what graduate school is like, or what an undergraduate environment is like, or what a department is like for a faculty member, that environment is designed to support and culture a particular kind, support success, but only for particular kinds of people who are pre-adapted for that particular culture. And so this relates to the concept of homophily. The idea is that when we bring people into our environments, we are choosing people who are like ourselves. When we recognize excellence, we are recognizing excellence from people based on the template of what we perceive as excellence, which is based on our own cultural background. And so this results in a really homogeneous academic environment. So what I'd like you to, so here are some terms that all relate to these issues of prestige and accessibility in higher education. And so what I'm going to ask you to do, just for 30 seconds, is to choose one of these terms that you think is, that you're not exactly sure what it means or how we use it, and try to pin down a definition for it. So what does it mean for an institution to be accessible? What does it mean for an institution to be excellent or to be elite or prestigious? So just pick one of these terms, give yourselves 30 seconds. I want you to write this down on a piece of paper. I'm not going to hold you account for it, but I'd like you to do that. I'm going to step aside. 30 seconds. All right. I wanted to give you an opportunity to just engage with these ideas and to see how your preconceptions might meet with some of the things that I have to say and how they relate to your experience at USC or wherever you might be. So it turns out that the term meritocracy is new. It was invented in 1958. Like before then, it just does not appear. And actually it was generated as a piece of satire. And actually by two different people, it was used by satire in the same year, but mostly this one. And where it was like the idea that the ruling class got this idea that they somehow deserved it because of their talents rather than just the fact that they were merely the ruling class. And so before that time, it was just accepted that people understood that the ruling class was there because they inherited it from prior generations, is my understanding. Maybe some people thought it was somehow earned, you know, but only in the last few decades have actually people bought into this conceit that if someone has more money, if someone has a better job, if someone has a greater position of authority, that they are there purely because of their own talent and capability, like it's somehow merit. And so this was satire. And so the first time that meritocracy was considered to be used in a sarcastic way was in 1972 in the magazine National Affairs. Daniel Bell was like, oh, well, actually this person thought it was satire, but actually that's really true. And so if we think a lot of the social ills that we're experiencing at the moment, a lot of this can, and a lot of the problems with accessibility in higher education, it delves deep into the myth of meritocracy that really only has emerged within the last 50 years. Before then, it actually wasn't even that hard to get into Harvard in terms of like the rejection rate for Harvard was relatively low. It's just that people never applied because you'd have to get the application by mail, you'd have to fill it out, and you know, and so so admissions only have become competitive there within the last few decades, and that's because more people want to access that prestige as they thought that they might deserve it by merit, whereas before people just understood that it was not a function of merit. Sorry, mouse. Okay. So let me show you a pedigree analysis. I'm sure you're quite familiar with something like this. So this is the one for hemophilia and the royal family. Let me show you a different, and so again, this is how authority and prestige is inherited. Similarly, here's my own genealogy, my academic genealogy. And so there's a whole website that does these academic genealogies. And so I'm down in the bottom in the middle. It goes to my advisor, Michael Breed, then Charles Michener. Go back up, it goes to Alexander Humboldt, which is kind of cool, I guess, right? Ooh, I'm academically descended from Humboldt. So in the world of ecology, there is, because that's my specialty, there's a well-circulated image that was used in a festive presentation decades ago. And this is the academic tree for G. Evelyn Hutchinson, who was a really famous marine ecologist who trained a lot of scientists, and scientists trained a lot of scientists. And so, again, this is shared unironically and with, you know, great esteem in the field of ecology. And on one hand, I think it's spectacular to show what a great mentor Hutchinson actually was in training his students, and then inspired his students then to do a lot of work. But a lot of people who don't have a place in this tree also see this as exclusionary, because essentially what this tree is doing is it's placing a higher value, a higher esteem on the people who are descended from those in that tree. And so on one hand, it looks really positive, but if you're coming at it from a different perspective, then all of a sudden, this perspective that you inherit your quality and your prestige from where you come from can be really exclusionary. If I were to show this to students at CSU Dominguez Hills, they would look at this and they say, well, where did all these people go to school? And so are you on that tree? How am I going to fit on here? Like this looks like a manifestation of a culture to which people don't belong. And so it is anti-inclusive, for lack of a better way of putting it. Here's another tree. You might have seen this before. It was from Yale Magazine from several years ago, the Alumni Magazine, and they were talking about their efforts to recruit students, and they're trying to find more minoritized students and more low-income students. And they said they're out there. Smart students from poor families are out there, but they're hard to find. And they were serious, right? And so I think basically this is where the people writing for the Yale magazine usually said the quiet part out loud, where a lot of folks are thinking it, but they genuinely said it. This actually did cause some sort of uproar, and people were upset. I'm going to go back for a bit. And so ultimately, a few issues later, there was a response where they were explaining, no, actually, we really, really do think that we have to try hard to find low-income people who are capable of succeeding at Yale. And so basically, they doubled down. And I'm going to read this out loud to you. Is Yale's concentrated excellence a factor that mitigates its obligation to search even farther and wider for the promising poor, to spend even more on them when they arrive, and to take even more chances on them when their files reach the admissions office? Or is Yale's excellence, the weight of the examples it sets, the reach of the alumni it breeds, what obliges it to do all of these things, perhaps as aggressively as alumni did Amherst and Vassar, which were provided as counterexamples to what they were doing? So now, this is like a bingo scorecard for a lot of those words and ideas, which I had you think about earlier on. And so I just want to use this to talk about toxic perspectives in prestigious institutions and how they constitute barriers. So Yale says that they're just owning the fact that they have concentrated excellence, what that might be. And then they're supposed to search for the promising poor. So some poor are promising and some poor are not promising, I'm assuming, because they have to search for the promising poor. What constitutes the poor who have greater promise? And then when they find the promising poor, they're not quite promising enough because they still have to take chances on them. Now, I hear many things like this all the time, not necessarily in those words, when people are talking about trying to recruit students from CSU Dominguez Hills, or recruiting students in any other graduate admissions committee or in faculty searches, not necessarily using this particular language, but the idea is that that talent is hard to find, and that it's not cultivated. You merely have to bring these people in, and then you're doing them a favor by investing more resources on them rather than actually doing your duty as part of the community that you are. Next sentence is, or is it Yale's excellence, the weight of the examples it sets, the reach of the alumni it breeds, right? They are breeding alumni, right? So they are basically explaining how the social and academic and cultural capital that they are investing into their people by bringing them in. They set an example, they are Yaleys. And so those people are excellent because they went to Yale, is what they're saying. So let's take a look at some of these issues from a quantitative perspective to see how they would affect our community and our students. Does affiliation with a prestigious institution actually correct career outcomes? Let's find out. In the Journal of Research on Social Stratification and Mobility, yeah, there's a whole journal. They asked recruiters from professional service firms what criteria they looked at when they were hiring people. In this case, 1% type jobs, law firms, investment banks, and so on. And they said that the top thing they looked at more than anything else was school prestige. And the other things they were looking at were employment prestige and grades and extracurricular activities. And also the ability to have high grades and perform in extracurricular activities also has close socioeconomic ties as well, right? And so if all those other factors weren't really looked at. But essentially, they're looking at what extracurriculars did you do and how fancy of a school did you go to. Again, we know this, but they actually are explicitly owning this fact. Then let's take a look in academia at computer science departments and business departments and history departments, where you look at the proportion of faculty who are attending graduate school at a particular institution, and then you see where they get hired for faculty jobs. And so essentially what you see is about 80% of the faculty are coming from 25% of the institutions, more or less. So these are extraordinarily tight networks. So people say, if you don't go to a top 10 or top 20 institution, don't bother trying to get a faculty job because that's the way the network is built. And what this is saying is, well, yes, that is often true in different kinds of academic disciplines. So if you look at this a different way, here's the structure of that network for faculty hiring in computer science, where essentially these 10 institutions keep training graduate students and handing them to one another. And so MIT creates all these people that go off to Cornell and Carnegie Mellon, Berkeley and Stanford or so on. And so this network is very tightly knit. And if you're not in this network in the first place, then you're not going to be able to continue to access that network, because there's this element of exclusivity in how this network is built. And so if you look at this network if you look at different kinds of institutions, then let's see how their nodes are structured. Then in computer science and business and history. And what you see is the less prestigious institutions in a particular program will have broader networks, but the more prestigious institutions have far narrower networks. So if you look at the institutional ranking, the network is really tight. And institutional ranking is low, the network is really broad. So essentially, you have more diversity in terms of training from people who are at lower ranked institutions, where you have these institutions that are higher ranked. Higher ranking means that you're more homophilous, that you're drawing from the same exact pool. Let's take a look at NSF graduate research fellowships. You might have seen posts of mine on my blog about this. And so a lot of these data analyses are from Natalie Tellis. And so if you look at the undergraduate applicants for an NSF graduate research fellowships, then basically half of the awards go to people who are in the ranked in top 30 that are in the top 30 schools. So the shape of this distribution is that the bulk of people are attending a relatively small number of institutions. Let's dive into the diversity of NSF graduate research fellowship recipients more, and you look at how much the schools cost where they attend. Essentially, if you attend a school that is in the bottom half in terms of cost in public and private categories, then you ain't gonna get a GRFP for the most part, right? And so there's very, very few people who are in low prestige institutions who will get them. But also if you look, once institutions are more expensive, which makes them more exclusive and less accessible, then what means is that those expensive institutions will actually result in a greater number of their students every year getting GRFPs. So last year was an amazing one for CSU Dominguez Hills, that we had 2 people get a GRFP. And normally it's 0 or 1. As the director of undergraduate research, it's my job to create a lot more of those. But I'm also working against the reality that these other institutions have a head start, and they have this homophilous environment, which selectively favors people coming from that background. Let's take a look at the institutions of recipients and where people went to undergraduates and they got their awards. And what you see among the top level is like there's massive, massive numbers coming from these 10 institutions. Out of 2,000 awards, 300, 400 of them every year are coming from people who attended these 4 universities. Let's take a look at the income level of people involved in these institutions. On the right shows you all accredited institutions and the percent of students that have Pell Grants. And on the left, we'll show you the ones that had students getting awarded for the GRFP. And what we're seeing is that the institutions that generate students who get NSF Graduate Research Fellowships are ones that have wealthier students. So essentially, having more low-income students in your institution is associated with less likely being to get an NSF Graduate Fellowship. I'm not saying that NSF is inherently to blame in their review process for this. It's a greater phenomenon where probably the applicant pool is a lot smaller at these institutions because it takes time and work to apply. And these institutions don't have the resources to support their students, which is why I'm spending a lot of my time now trying to work with people applying for the GRFP to make up for that. But again, it's a systemic problem. One person I worked with a few years ago received this comment on their GRFP reviews: great student, mediocre institution. And so that was a ding on their application. And so you could say, yeah, that's a one-off. That was one, rotten apple in the barrel, one bad reviewer. But truly, the idea that a reviewer can say something like this, and then the panel allows that comment to occur, and it's part of the discussion, and it ends up in the comments that the applicant gets. This is what many people are thinking, that the students' quality of their application is harmed because of the identity of the institution that they're attending. And so there's this idea that where you end up going to school reflects your quality. But if you look at how the mechanisms by which high school students get into college and where they choose to go to college, again, that's more of homophily and social class sorting than anything else. So we spend a lot of time talking about bias training. And so let's worry about whether or not someone has a buried gender bias or an ethnicity bias that somehow might affect their behavioral decisions. But there's an explicit bias we deal with all the time that associates with race and class, and that's institutional prestige bias. So not too many people are willing to look me in the face or even say to me on social media and say, oh, well, actually, the students at CSU Dominguez Hills are less competitive and they're less talented than students at other institutions. They feel as if that they cannot communicate that concept. But that is an often explicit bias that people actually harbor, because they imagine that institutions that are less selective will have people who have less talent or less competitive or somehow less worthy. And so this is institutions like to brag about their rankings because they think that's an indicator of quality. And attending a highly ranked institution is a measure of prestige, but people don't like to talk explicitly about the word prestige. It's like it's a hush hush. It's like, the way that class is in the UK, you don't talk about it. And so if you attend no one's going to tell a student that they didn't get accepted to a program because they are attending a less prestigious institution. But yet that often happens where students will be like, oh, you went to Stanford, you must be pretty good. Whereas we'd never hear that about one of our students. So in our academic culture, what is the function of prestige? Like, what is prestige doing for us? But also, how does it work in our environment? And essentially, what prestige is, I would argue, is that it allows resources to be hoarded within an institution and passed on to similar people. It's a mechanism to be able to hoard resources. You're familiar with the college bribery scandal. I've been speaking enough truth to power. I won't rub it in. I've deleted a couple slides. But I would like to read this bit from McSweeney's from the University of Pennsylvania. So this is not real because it's from McSweeney's. But it says, when we learned that at least 50 people participated in a massive college admission scam, deploying fraudulent means to get their children into nation's elite universities, we were appalled, disgusted, and outraged that not a single one of them was using these deviant tactics to get into the University of Pennsylvania. And I think that's what a lot of institutions really felt. They're like, wow. And so actually, and this was actually kind of a wake-up call to me. Then I found out that the scandal actually resulted in a lot of people trying to bribe their way into USC. And I was like, wow, I didn't know it was hard to get in. I honestly didn't. I grew up in Southern California and I had no idea. Things have changed. Wow. Huh. It's rather exclusive. 13% acceptance rate. Wow. I had no idea. And so this, I think, actually highlights a lot of the structural issues, not in how institutions choose to do admissions, but but purely about institutional identity in and of itself, and how rankings and prestige result in inequities and perpetuate them. So here's a question. Can we leverage prestige to increase the representation of people in marginalized groups? So in other words, there like a lot of institutions like Yale, for example, they would say, we want to recruit people, the promising poor, and then give them these opportunities, give them this Yale identity, and then they can have success because of their association with something that's elite. In other words, could we actually use this idea that institutions are prestigious or elite and use that for good? You know, since, you know, you've got a $4 billion endowment, right? So maybe you could use that money to actually make social change by bringing people into your system and giving them the resources and the success that they otherwise wouldn't have. Can that work? Well, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of the Meyerhoff Scholars Program, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which among minority serving institutions is highly regarded, prestigious, in being excellent at providing opportunities and training for low-income students and students from underrepresented groups. And so one of the flagship programs that they run is Meyerhoff Scholars. So the institution landed a really big donor to create this huge scholarship for students where they recruit students in, and then they give these students all kinds of resources throughout college, and then they advance into like prestigious graduate programs. And so the Meyerhoff Scholars Program is designed for students of color. And so the way they work is, according to this article in Science Magazine, is they are unapologetically elitist. It targets high-achieving students bent on an academic career. We're talking either high school applicants or people just first year in college that say, oh, like if you happen to be in college and you know you want a PhD already and you're a student of color, then you would apply for the Meyerhoff program. And then you have to score really well on these exams to get into the Meyerhoff program. And then, so what basically this program is doing is taking people who would otherwise probably have some level of success and then what they would do is then give them more resources to make them even more prestigious and more successful. And so when you meet a Meyerhoff scholar, they're very polished and they have lots of experience and they get admitted to graduate programs all the time. That's what the Meyerhoff Scholar Program is built. And so could institutions increase diversity and promote inclusivity by scaling up? Well, some folks think that's true, but someone told me this. Meyerhoff won't move the needle nationally. They accept very few students and the cost is over $50,000 per student per year. They increase the fraction of students moving on to grad school from individual institutions, but it cannot scale to most universities. So in other words, this is a ton of resources being put into a relatively small number of students. So it is not fixing a problem, it's just plugging a few holes. And so I should say this quote came to me from a colleague who basically runs a DEI outfit at a different institution. And you know, is it willing to put its name on it? Because that's how power structure works. So so why could a system like this not work? Well, Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." And so I was saying before at the beginning of the talk, well, why am I as a white guy in this position giving this kind of presentation? And I was saying, it's like, it's not my job to let people in. It's my job to convince you to help us transform our institutions so that they are accessible. And so elitism, or being elite, or exclusivity, which you might call selectivity, gets in the way of equity and access. And so we need to deconstruct those walls to be able to have a truly equitable environment, because we're not going to have economic equality all across the United States or anywhere anytime really soon. And so if we're going to have people come into academia in an equitable fashion, then we need to make sure that people have access. And so now I'm just about to assault the entire concept of excellence. There's this paper that came out 4 years ago, which is absolutely amazing, that tries to define what excellence is based on how it's used by different institutions. So if you look at mission statements and plans and whatever, and so they're trying to understand what excellent means. And what they have decided in the end is excellence doesn't mean anything. It's merely pernicious and dangerous rhetoric that undermines the foundations of good research and scholarship. So people use the term excellence however they want to use it to justify or qualify whatever they want. So if there's an applicant which is excellent, you say, oh, that person is excellent. What makes them excellent? Well, eventually that definition is going to end up being tautological or nonsensical or homophilous. So often excellence is a matter of homophily. And so this is a really good paper. I highly recommend it. I'm going to read a whole paragraph here about what we should do to abolish the concept of excellence to operate our institutions in a more equitable fashion. Like, so, okay, so don't talk about excellence. What do you talk about? Our argument here is not that expanding our boundary for resourcing from excellence to soundness and capacity is all that is necessary to change research culture and improve the distribution of resources. So they're arguing that soundness and capacity building are important institutional values rather than excellence, or they should be. It is a move from resourcing based on the performance of an ineluctable quality to one based on the demonstration of documentable, socially developed practice. It is the first step to solving the problems our rhetoric of excellence has created. So excellence has created problems, and we need to fix that by abolishing that from our language. Soundness appears to be a plausible basis on which to build a new narrative, or rather to combine existing threads into a more consistent rhetorical framework. Such a framework will work to refocus our attention on research that is sufficiently valuable to be worth pursuing. To drive adoption and practice towards making this real, however, will require more than narrative, will require resources to be redistributed towards supporting a broader class of research activities, right? So in other words, some kinds of research are labeled as excellent, and that's not what's being done. So we were talking about before the session opened about what happens in NIH is how scientists of color are being underfunded, a lot in part because NIH is not funding the fields of research that these minoritized scholars find to be high priority. So in other words, NIH isn't funding Black folks because Black folks want to fund important public health questions that NIH isn't funding because they don't think it's as excellent of a question. It's less meritorious. So if we instead value work based on its capacity building and its soundness, then that would abolish that kind of problem. So let's take a look at what HHMI is up to. So inclusive excellence. HHMI wants to increase the number of scientists of color. So they have a program of inclusive excellence, which means what? So the only reason they're saying excellence here is they want to make sure that people understand that when they're supporting diversity, that doesn't mean you're sacrificing quality, which of course, you know, if you're funding someone, you don't fund someone because of their ethnicity, you fund them because they're competitive. But you're being inclusive, meaning you're allowing them in. Like, if I think about inclusive excellence, if you try to define what that terminology means, it doesn't mean anything, or it does mean anything. It's it says something about their institutional values. And so HHMI values excellence above all else. They want to support excellent researchers, right? And so that means if they're trying to promote diversity, it has to be inclusive excellence. And so how are they going to have inclusive excellence across all kinds of institutions? Well, let's spend more money. And so they actually have now created IE, inclusive excellence institutions, and you can apply for them. And there's 57 of them currently, and they're different kinds of institutions. And what they all have in common is that they serve minority students. So let's take a look at these a little bit more. This last year, they were funding up to 30 schools, and they're providing $1 million. Get that, $1 million over 5 years, and will not be renewable. So HHMI's vaunted inclusive excellence program is giving $200,000 a year for 5 years, and that's it. Like, I'm writing a grant to NSF for that much right now, and it's not going to change the world. It's actually not a massive scale project. And so that's the vaunted inclusive excellence program, is to spend that kind of money. That is not going to transform institutions in the slightest. It's just brownwashing for HHMI. And so what HHMI wants to do is to scale up the Meyerhoff Scholars Program, actually, is their plan, is to launch it in many other institutions. So their plan for inclusive excellence is to create these small centers of eliteness. But the problem is, whenever you have these elite centers, then you don't have access. If you don't have access, then how can you have equity? So let me sum up my main points here. There are huge benefits associated with prestigious institutions. Prestigious institutions operate under this notion that selectivity is a mechanism to determine quality, that they believe in the myth of meritocracy, right? When you are admitting people selectively based on the traits in their applications, at some extent, you're buying into this myth of meritocracy. And so these prestigious institutions filter out people with marginalized identities. Sometimes they do it with active bias. Sometimes they do it with passive bias. But that's the way they work. I will argue that the quality of an institution's people is independent of selectivity. I will argue right now that the undergraduates that you have at USC are not more academically talented than the undergraduates we have at CSU Dominguez Hills. Yet you have a 13% admissions rate, and we have an open enrollment. And once you start working with some of our students, then let's say you take them in the lab for the summer, you'd have a hard time disagreeing. Prestige exists in higher education for this generational transmission of social capital, right? That's why people give to endowments. That's why that money is there, is so that can be transferred to the next generation. Prestige can be leveraged by some people in marginalized groups to access positions of power. Some things like when institutions deign to allow a relatively small number of minority people in, or when there's programs like the Meyerhoff Scholar programs. But ultimately, this redistribution of social capital using institutional prestige is inequitable. And if you really, really want to transform the institution, then what's going to happen is you're going to lose prestige. Because right now, the way prestige works requires that selectivity. And once you lose that selectivity, then you lose the ranking associated with the prestige. So then, how should we regard prestige if we're working to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion? So my abstract told you I give you some recommendations. My biggest recommendation is to revise your template, to unlearn your personal image of what the characteristics of a young academic are. Like, revise your template. When you get an application, when you're talking to someone, like, oh, this person's talented, this person could be good, this person will do good research. What makes you say that? How and why? Rethink that. This is something I had to relearn while at CSU Dominguez Hills, and I was there for quite a while. Recruit from low prestige institutions. Recruit locally. Most normal people aren't ready to pack up their bags and move across the whole country. And some of my most talented students, meaning the students who have actually achieved the most in research that I've seen, who have worked with me and co-authored papers and all these things, they have family, personal, whatever issues, they're not going to pick up and move. And so this idea that you can just pick up and move across the country for 5 years to go to grad school, then go somewhere else for a postdoc and blah, 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 get a new job in Kansas, that's the kind of thing that happens if you're middle-class white folk. That's not a thing that people typically do. And if you're trying to actually be genuinely accessible and equitable, that means you've got to recruit locally. And I think if you recruit from the Los Angeles area, you'll still have just as much talent than if you're to bring people in from all around the world. Build genuine and equal partnerships with institutions that serve minoritized students. How do you know when you have a student who will succeed? You know it when you see it, and you know it when you work with them and they start to succeed. Right, so if you build these relationships, if you get to know us and our students well, then you can take our word for it. When we say this student will succeed, this student will be ready to go, then if we're genuinely partners, then you'll believe us. Value and reward work based on soundness and capacity building. So it's not, so in other words, don't worry about whether or not something is excellent, make sure it's sound. Because oftentimes, if you look through the pages of science, something looks really excellent, but ain't that sound because it gets retracted a month later. Value accessibility instead of selectivity. So at CSU Dominguez Hills, we are proud of our accessibility. And we are proud that we turn away as few students as possible. Whereas most institutions fight really hard to bring in a huge number of applicants so they can turn them away so that you can say you're really selective. So USC might be really proud of its 13% acceptance rate for undergraduates. For me, that means that that institution is failing 87% of the people that wanted to go there and couldn't get in. And so obviously you can't take everyone in. But that's not to say it should be a point of pride. Prioritize the professional growth of people over product in hiring, retention, tenure, promotion. Prioritize the quality of mentorship as a key criterion in hiring and promotion. So instead of worrying about someone's H score and how much money they bring in, maybe worry about the people in their labs. Develop a holistic review process for admissions. So look at a broad variety of criteria, which would de-emphasize the identity of a person's institutions and their scores and their grades. And once you have candidates that clear a baseline, why not just admit them randomly? Just an idea. And I've gone a couple minutes over, but I do have time for questions and all that. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Hi, I don't know. I think I hid myself. But yeah, I don't know if you can hear me, but we certainly have time for questions. And then I think, I think we can take this like a panel too. Ricky, you can weigh in as well. But you can, the first one is from an anonymous attendee. Can you elaborate on your personal experience of revising your own template for recruiting students? And what are some of the new criteria that you forced yourself to learn and use?
Well, I think when I was revising my own template about what makes a student successful or what criteria would make a student successful, I think there are so many students that I had worked with who I thought weren't necessarily going to make it or couldn't necessarily get a concept just based on my own biases and prior experiences. Like, so a lot of students that come to CSU Dominguez Hills are very underprepared. They don't have the greatest experience in writing. They don't have great writing skills, like math and basic arithmetic. They're not quite, sometimes not there with. And so some people think that that actually means that the students aren't smart or capable. But the thing is, they have tremendous ideas. Not only do they work really hard, but also are brilliant. And so I think but when I started my emphasis on supporting the professional development of students, and I didn't worry so much about what they could do for me, but how they could professionally develop, then as a result, the quality, the soundness of their work was quite high. And so now I really barely even look at, say, GPA or anything like that when a student is trying to come into my lab, because that's just simply not a predictor of how well they're do. And so often what I found is people who are really open and to doing research are ones that might not necessarily have done really well in school because they haven't been really focused on grades, because they were more interested in other things. And so I've just experienced that working with a population of students who in general, their scores tend not to meet the criteria for highly selective institutions, can still be really successful. And so I found out that if I were to succeed in my environment mentoring students, I had to abandon my template for what people generally think of as is a promising student, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to train students.
Ricky, do you want to weigh in? And you're at the elite institution. You were formerly a professor at CSU Dominguez Hills, a minority serving institution. So you've seen it all.
Well, I spent most of the presentation nodding my head in agreement, and I think the personal template is a big issue. I mean, I'm aware of my own biases, and in fact, I actually try to use that when I'm interviewing graduate students. Like, and this is probably problematic too, but like, I have a preference for working class kids because I was a working class kid. I have a preference for underrepresented minorities because I was an underrepresented minority. And if I can hear the thread in their thinking about their description of themselves and align it with myself, then I feel really comfortable. Often I'm not taking chances, but I feel comfortable saying, okay, let's make this happen. I mean, I think the other piece that Dr. McGlynn was referring to that is also that you have to mentor in a different way. And maybe could you just talk to that about some of your techniques for helping students? Because a lot of times people feel like they can't do things even though they can. And so how do you help get them out of that space?
Yeah, and so I would say the biggest challenge that our students experience is actually under entitlement, right? That they whereas I think, when I was at a place that was wealthier, I dealt with a lot of over entitled students who thought they were more capable than they were, where they tried to tackle things they weren't quite ready to do. Whereas like with my students with Dominguez, they can't imagine that they're possibly capable of doing something. The idea that we'd even publish a paper based on this project, oh my God, we could publish a paper based on that. That's amazing. Or the idea that they could earn authorship on a paper, or that even that they're capable of writing a piece of R code to do a particular analysis or something. It's just like, and so to work with students, ultimately, I think you need to build a relationship so that they have confidence in you, so that when you tell them that they're capable, they believe you. And so I used to think before, when a student was thankful that I cared about them when I was teaching, that wasn't necessarily a positive sign. That it's like, well, they're just, my quality as a teacher and a mentor is my performance. But now I realize actually what's important is that building this relationship is key. And so it's it is more work to work with students who are not as prepared, because they have catching up to do. But that's not to say that they're less capable. And so, and I think a lot of it is probably discipline specific. I think it's a really key strategy is to have more experienced students in your lab coming from the same background who you worked with for 2-3 years, and you have a multi-tiered mentoring. So if you have a senior who can work with like sophomores and freshmen, for example, then that really, really helps the confidence of the students, because having students having students see other capable students and seeing that those students believe in them actually has greater power than I could as a faculty member, at least, or like, should I say, a middle-class white old dude faculty member.
Not that old, but yeah. So good. There's a couple more questions. So one of them is from Joe Glass. Thank you, Joe, for putting this in. I love the idea about evaluating soundness over excellence. Can you talk more about the definition of soundness as you would apply it in a faculty recruitment?
Yeah. So I've been on search committees in the last few years, right? I would say it's more like what you don't look at than what you look at. So maybe instead of looking at what journal the paper is in, you read the paper. You know, look at the abstract. Is the work cool, right? And so maybe instead of looking at how many, citations is a complex measure, because part of it is how impactful work is, but also it's how visible it is. But ultimately, if it's sound, like, would it be successful in your environment? Would that work promote success of students in the environment? And like, without worrying about what other people think, do you think it's good? So in other words, don't rely on other people's measures, because often excellence is considered to be thought how other people perceive it, right? Oftentimes when people define excellence, it's like an externally validated measure, but it's usually externally through some type of thing associated with prestige. Whereas like if it's in a good journal, or if it has a lot of citations, or if it was funded by this grant, or it came from a prestigious laboratory. But I think actually I think we're really concerned about for faculty members is actually capacity building, where it's like, so do they have is what they're doing, can they grow in the way that we want them to grow? Is their work something that we can build on in our institution and can help support and grow the success of students and build a more successful lab that is, more productive and impactful? But like soundness, take a look at the statistics. Do the statistics make sense? Look at the experimental design. Is there adequate sample size? Like sometimes you can look at a whole bunch of paper and realize, well, they're really milking this work to make it stretch as far as possible in terms of papers. Other labs are just really just trying to do sound work. I mean, I think it's really discipline specific.
Ricky, you want to weigh in, or?
No, I thought that was good.
Okay. What is it okay, Terry, if we keep you just a minute longer?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't have anywhere to be immediately, so we're good. Yeah.
Okay. So let's see here.
Do you want to do Lalo's question?
Oh,
what
is
your experience getting other faculty to buy into this thinking? These faculty are often palace guards that prevent recruitment of these students into our departments and schools.
Well, in my department, in my own department, I personally don't have that issue at all, because I think our department is just wonderful and we're on the same page with all this stuff. And so, I mean, we still have a challenge at our department, even though our students are principally Latinx, our faculty are primarily white, which is a really difficult challenge. I'm not going to say, they're not out there. They're not, but but oftentimes it's a challenge to hire people, to have them want to be able to come to our institution. And so, but when I go to other institutions, I think there are some people who are like, yeah, rock on. And the other people, I'm not sure if I buy these ideas. I mean, I think these are genuinely radical ideas, in that I'm saying we should be abandoning our idea of what it means of valuing excellence and eliteness, and not giving a damn about the rankings for reals, and operationalizing that means massive institutional transformation. And so some people are on board with that, but some people are like, but that just doesn't work for me. And I don't know, And so I think, and so I don't know how many people I've actually convinced, but I think if I just keep talking about this in very stark terms, then some folks might listen. But ultimately, I think people usually don't get it unless it comes from their own lived experience, right? What I'd like to do, and I think what really would make a difference, is if people actually like took sabbaticals, like 6 months, a year, and spent time in actual low prestige institutions. Like imagine if a faculty member from USC like was at Dominguez Hills for a whole freaking year, like going to our faculty meetings, teaching our students, being in our environment. But the whole visiting for a few days, like you don't get it. I think it's like it takes a while to understand the lived experiences of other people. And again, and also I want to be really careful that I don't want to serve as some kind of prophet or explain other people's lived experiences. I'm just trying to explain how I feel like that is my job to help prepare our own institutions.
No, that's a brilliant idea. Seriously, I like it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting listening to you talk, Dr. McGlynn, because you sound more like a sociologist than an ecologist. And one of the things we've talked a lot about, at least in the last 6 months, via Zoom, right, is the fact that the students who end up at Dominguez Hills end up there not because they're not talented, but because there's a whole social system and economic structure closing other doors to them.
Yeah.
Literally closing other doors to them. The fact that they come there and my last year there, I got to see under the hood a fair bit. There's an enormous disservice being done to the students who go there in the preparation space, right? So we've underfunded high schools thanks to Prop 13 and residential segregation and having bad priorities. And so students are in schools that are, too many kids in the class, not enough focus on instruction, not enough help for their families in a real way, so that they can have the stability that, for instance, I and my wife have been able to provide for my kids, right? And I'll just overshare a little bit, like, getting the selectivity is expensive, right? So I sent both of my children to very expensive college preparatory schools. I'm sending them to very expensive private universities now because I want to maximize their opportunity. But that comes at a cost. So that's closing the door to other people. And I don't feel good about that, but it is what it is. I don't feel bad enough about it not to do it. So, but I do think part of your message is, and this is a question I think we can ask ourselves at IAS and USC, is there's a difference. We can take students who will excel in our environment if we make the environment hospitable. We can take faculty who are different than the current faculty that we have, and they will succeed if we make the environment hospitable. And that means giving them resources, understanding where they're coming at it, and changing our priorities. And that's the thing that troubles me the most in my new position, is that I know the answer to social justice, and it's that people that have stuff have to give it to other people.
Right. You have to change your priorities.
That's the bottom line, is that we have maldistributed the good things in life. And so we have these obvious outcomes. So I salute you for the work that you do at Dominguez Hills every day. And as I already said, I really appreciate your perspective, and hopefully some of your thinking will be adopted here at USC and other places that are interested in a more equitable system.
Well, thanks for your time.
Yeah, well said. There's a couple more questions, and what we can do is we can hopefully answer them via email if Terry's available.
Yeah.
But we've gone over the time. Thank you so much. Really, really intriguing and useful information. Appreciate it. Thanks to all those tuning in. Thanks, Ricky, for co-hosting and being on the panel. And until next time, enjoy yourself and have a great day.
Thanks a lot.